chapter 16, and I have been talking with Pastor Greg, and as we were going through the season of Lent and the time of preparation, preparing for Easter, one of the sermons that I had preached was self-denial is about more than just potato chips. And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, for Easter you got to preach Easter is more than just colored eggs and chocolate bunnies. And I thought, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And so as I began to pray about it and work with it, I realized that, Easter is so much more than that. And I want to stop and say right now in this moment, I'm so glad you're here today. I know how much you have going on. I know how many things are on your mind. And I know how many other places you could be at this moment. And I'm really glad that you're here. Because it gives us a chance to worship and to celebrate together. And please don't take that as just words from the pastor that the pastor has to say. Those of you who know me know I genuinely mean that. I am glad you are here today. It gives us a chance to do this. And I'm going to ask you to go one step further. Not to just be physically present, but to actually be mentally present. Because as I have grown older, Easter has taken on many different meanings. As a kid, my primary concern with Easter, eggs and bunnies. I went to church, but really I couldn't wait to get out of church on Sunday so that I could go home and have
Eggs and bunnies.
Yeah, not real eggs, the stuff that was inside the plastic eggs, candy, right? The candy, and maybe if the Easter bunny left a quarter in there or some money in there. I was really excited about that stuff. Couldn't wait to go home and to have that. Now as a parent, it means different things. I'm not the one looking for eggs and bunnies. I'm the one responsible for maybe filling and hiding. And that was a lot of fun. And I will tell you, I'm really glad the Easter Bunny remembered to hide stuff last night before going to bed. Because the kids were up at 4:45 this morning. They managed to let us wait until 5:45. It's very kind of them. They were kind of quiet. But it's all of these different roles and all of these things that Easter now means. And my parents are coming up later for lunch, and so that means planning dinner, but also making sure that the house looks presentable, and all of these other things that we do as grown-ups whenever holidays roll around. Holidays are a lot more work as an adult than they are a kid. Has anyone else found that? Yeah. And when people start to come to your house and you're not the one that's just traveling everywhere, there's all of these things to do. And I know what it's like to have those things run through your mind and to not really be focused or engaged in the things that you're doing. But I want to get you to focus this morning, to really pay attention, to really zone into what we're doing and not be thinking about all the stuff that's coming afterwards. I won't tell you about the really great ham that we have ready for later. No, all of these great things, doesn't it slip right in there? It's so easy to think about that stuff. And if we're not careful, we can spend all of our energy, all of the energy that we have for Easter, in preparing baskets, bunnies, food, family, and yet miss the real reason to celebrate Easter. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. I told you we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, and what we're reading in the Gospel of Mark is chapter 16. It's verses 1 through 8. And I bet if you were to skim ahead in your Bible down to the end of verse 8, you're going to find this little section in there that says, some of the oldest manuscripts and more reliable texts don't have the following verses. They don't have 9 through 20, because many reliable scholars, many trustworthy scholars really believe that the Gospel of Mark ends right at verse 8. In fact, if you were to go through it and to look, what they end with is the preposition for. Now, our English versions have cleaned it up a little bit, but it leaves you hanging. And with the kids and all of the fun stuff that we do, my reading skills have grown, and I am phenomenal at reading Dr. Seuss books. I don't know if you are familiar with Pete the Cat, but Pete the Cat is pretty awesome. He has a cousin, Splat the Cat, also pretty awesome. Let's see, Pinkalicious? Any of you heard Pinkalicious? No, you're thinking, well, I'm missing these, right? Berenstain Bear books, right? Yeah, all of these great books. But they have a common theme. At the end of almost every book are two words. The end. And the problem that we run into with the Gospel of Mark when we stop at verse 8, even though most scholars really think that that's the end, it doesn't feel like it. And so I'm telling you right now, we're going to read this passage, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8, but it's not going to feel like the end, but most scholars really think that's it, and it's bothered us for a long time. So when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early in the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. I love those phrases in the Bible. They were alarmed, and the next word from the angel is, "Don't be alarmed." There's a good reason they would be alarmed. If you were going to the tomb, expecting to find the body of Jesus, and somebody was sitting there, what would your reaction be?
Alarmed.
Alarmed. If I can be a parent for a moment, it's a really good reason to have extra clothes along. I'm serious. Alarmed. We read this and it doesn't have much impact on us. But I'm telling you, if you go to the grave and the person you expect to be seeing is not there, but somebody sitting up in white is there, you're going to be alarmed. And so the phrase, "don't be alarmed," strikes me as kind of ironic. It's like when clients come in and they're all really nervous and anxious, and I say to them, "Relax." They don't just relax. And let me tell you something, they didn't just stop being alarmed. That just didn't go away. But the angel goes on and he says, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, the one who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." You know how they didn't stop being alarmed? It's this verse right here. "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." Isn't that a terrible place to put the end? Don't most of us feel like there should be something else? Because when we read Matthew, and when we read Luke, and we read John, what do? They go tell the disciples. They go do exactly what the angel has instructed them to do. Mark says they left bewildered. They left terrified, trembling and bewildered. When's the last time you were trembling with fear? I want you to think back for a moment. When's the last time you were really so afraid that you were trembling? I bet you have some moments. How was your decision-making ability? It wasn't the best. When we are that scared, it doesn't surprise me that the women ran home. Because when I am that afraid, honestly, I want to be someplace that I know well, someplace that I feel comfortable, someplace that I feel safe, someplace that I can anticipate what's going to happen next. Because as the women had been preparing for this day, this morning, this after the Sabbath, so that they could go and finish the burial of Jesus, they never anticipated this. The problem with us hearing the Easter story is we don't hear it for the first time. There's no surprise, there's no anticipation, there's no real shock. But this ending, when you read it and then you don't go on, they're shocked. You're like, wait a minute. This is not how it's supposed to be. And so the church struggled with this for a long time, and there's this great biblical term called redaction, or really more of a literary term. And the church said, we just can't leave it like this, because it looks like the disciples didn't listen and no one found out about Jesus. And so they got together, and they really felt that they needed to add the last few verses, starting in verse 9 to the end. Because when you read that, they put a last page in there that says the end. Oh yeah, they went home bewildered and frightened, but then they did the right thing. It all worked out. But one of the first things I want you to take away from this morning, sometimes the end isn't the end. We like endings. I love the books that say the end, because then I know I can stop reading and the kids can go to bed. And I say me, but a lot of times Jen's reading. I know that she's going to put the book down and the kids are going to go to bed. And I know that means like another 15 to 20 to 30, 45 minutes worth of stuff. But at some point, they're going to bed. We say those words, bedtime is going to happen. But sometimes the end isn't the end. Pastor Greg referenced the passing of Ruby and the passing of Lynn this week, and it's been interesting as it has hit many of us in the church. Because for most of us, when someone dies, that is the end. For many of us, that is our thinking, that is the end. But for the family members who are really close, that ending isn't the end. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of things to be planned. There's a lot of mourning to happen. There's a lot of grieving to be done. It may be the end, but it isn't the end. And at some point along the way, these things happen that we end up realizing that we have to begin to go back to work. And we have to find ways to carry on and to live and to do everything else that we were doing up until that moment happened. So just because it was the end doesn't mean it was the end. We never think about that, do we? Because the end is it. The end is all we look forward to. And so when Jesus' body was placed in the tomb before the Sabbath, all of the women who had wanted to prepare his body could not do that. It was not the end. And so because of Sabbath law, because of the religious system of the day, the rules, they could not finish burying Jesus on the Sabbath. Waiting is hard. In fact, a few years ago on Easter Sunday, we actually spent time talking about that Sabbath day, the day between the crucifixion and the day between the resurrection. Sometimes that waiting feels like it goes on forever. Lots of moments of hurry up and wait. And so here these women were. They knew what they wanted to do. They were thinking about how it would be done. And how do I know they were thinking about it? They had prepared. They had bought the spices. They were on their way as soon as it was daylight and they were able to go. And what was their concern of the day? What was their concern of the morning?
Moving the stone.
Who's going to move the stone? Were they expecting anyone to be alive inside that tomb? No. Because they knew that Jesus had died. They had watched Jesus die. And now, after what happened with him, their job to go and to complete the burial was to do this with the spices and to finish everything. But before they could actually have the ending, they had to wait. And I hate waiting. I hate waiting. In lots of different stages, in lots of different reasons, in lots of different ways. I don't know any of us who say, boy, I hope I get to wait today. I don't like it at stoplights. I don't like it at checkout lines. I don't like it when I'm waiting for lots of different things. This week, my dad had an MRI and we had to wait for the results to be interpreted. He couldn't wait. He actually called my wife and was like, hey, do you have any idea what this means? We don't like to wait. And so throughout the Sabbath, the women who were on their way to the tomb the next morning, they had waited and anticipated the day so that at least the end would become the end. Funny thing about the end, though. Sometimes the end isn't what we anticipate. When you actually read the Gospel of Mark this morning, and you see where it ends, and where most scholars really believe it ends, is that the ending that you anticipate to have, unless you're a student of the Gospel of Mark? No, because we know the Easter story. And most of the times, we take the stories that we have read in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, and we kind of overlay those to give ourselves what we feel is a very complete picture. But when we separate them out and we read what's really in the Gospels, we have to get a very different picture from what we've come to love and know. And so the story in Mark, the way it ends, it's not what we anticipated. Because what are the women supposed to do? After they finish bearing Jesus, they're supposed to go home. That's one anticipation ending. That's what their anticipation was. But after the angel tells them to go because Jesus is waiting for them, what are they supposed to do? What were the women supposed to do? They were to go. I mean, clearly, if an angel tells you to do something, you should go do it. And angels are often referred to as messengers of God, which is a much better translation of women, as beings who do the work of God, convey the messages of God. And so as you have this message, it is easy to take that and to assume that this is the message that God had for them, and that Jesus had for them. And you're always supposed to listen to Jesus, right? You're always supposed to listen to God. But let's be honest here. How many of us can think of times when we didn't? You don't have to put your hands up. But some of us have. I put mine. I'll be honest. There are times that I have done this, that I know God was telling me to do something, and I had much more of a Jonah moment, where I said, no way, God, not going to happen. I am not doing that. And I love the fact that Mark is honest enough to tell us that's what the women did. I love that. They were honest enough to say, not today, God. I appreciate the angel. I appreciate the message, but it is more than I can handle in this moment. And they went home. Sometimes the end just isn't what we anticipated. They never expected that this would be what they encountered on that resurrection morning. So the women reach the tomb, and they learn that Jesus is not there. The young man shares a message with them and gives them instructions, and they go home and they tell no one. But I think my favorite part about Mark, my favorite part about this ending, is the third truth that it gives us. Sometimes we get to work out the ending with God. You know, sometimes the end isn't the end. Sometimes the end isn't what we anticipated. But sometimes there is this possibility, this opportunity when we get to work out the ending with God. And one of my favorite things about that is that Mark leaves his readers, if you remove the redacted part, verses 9 and on, if you remove that part, the way we really believe Mark was originally written, do you know who's charged with following Jesus? The readers of the gospel. See, we have chalked this up to just, it was the job of the women to go on and to do this. It was the job of the women to go and to tell other disciples, or to go and to meet Jesus as Jesus had gone ahead of them. But when we have it this way, when the women go home and we're left with this unfinished, in other words, we didn't get a nice the end page, guess who gets to take part in this story? All of us. We get this opportunity to pick up where the women left off and to go in a way that shares and spreads the gospel. Now, most of you are saying, this is not exactly what I expected this morning. We expected to hear about Jesus. We expected to hear what he has done and what he can do in our life. But I'm actually going to tell you something a little different. If you know who Jesus is, if you believe that Jesus was who he said he was, then you have this opportunity presented to you to go and to follow Jesus. One of the things that I love is that Jesus sends the message through the young man, through the angel. He says, but go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you. You know, one of the truths that we encounter time and time again throughout Scripture, especially throughout Mark, is that Jesus would tell his disciples, they would go and find out, and they would see that Jesus had delivered just as he had said. For us, when we read this and we come to know that Jesus has gone ahead of us and is beckoning us to follow him, and that we will see him and meet him, it becomes this chance to fall into that promise of Mark. That if you are willing to go, if you are willing to follow where Jesus is leading, then you have the promise of meeting him and seeing him. Does that make sense? The challenge is that most of us typically go home from church on Easter Sunday, and we may not go home trembling, but we go home just like the women did, with no real effort to follow, with no real effort to meet, with no real expectation to encounter Jesus anywhere in our life. And we miss it. I want you to look at the Gospel of Mark differently, as though you are the one in this moment writing the last verses with God. What would your story look like? Would it be one where you go home and go about the rest of your day as planned? Or would it be one where you say, Jesus has called me to Galilee, Jesus has called me here, Jesus has called me to move, and I will go and find him as he has called me? Here's the challenge, though. Just as the end isn't always the end, and the end isn't always as we anticipated, and sometimes we get to write out the ending with God, God doesn't always do it the way we think God will. And so, I'm going to leave you with a very interesting spot this morning. A major choice. Are you going home to go about life as normal? Or are you going to find Jesus wherever Jesus may be calling you? I don't think you can do both in this. If Easter is more than chocolate bunnies and colorful eggs, then we need to do something that shows it's more than that to us in our life. So go back to the book of Mark. Go back to verse 7, back to verse 6. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Are you willing to go and see? Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for time together today. We thank you for this gospel lesson in Mark that is different than all of the other gospels. Because Jesus really doesn't say the end like we're used to. Help us to understand that when we follow you, the end is not the end. That there is so much more than we can imagine, more than we can anticipate, more than we can even dream to dream. And God, I pray that you would give us the courage to write out an ending with you. To write out an ending where we don't just go on with our lives and do everything else that we have to do to celebrate Easter in a worldly fashion, but that we would celebrate Easter by seeking out your Son Jesus and finding him right where he's calling us. God, help us to follow you well this day. Thank you for this time. Thank you for this Resurrection Sunday and this opportunity to be here today.